It's the week that you've all been waiting for. How do I look? Do I look different? It's because last weekend I kind of went out there and got myself monetized. What? I was so excited to see this kind of growth on the channel, and I'm so grateful for every one of you that have watched and engaged with my content so far. This has been a goal for me for the longest time, and I'm so grateful that I finally get to call this my job officially. So thank you so much for all of your love and support, and I'm so excited to bring you more content every single week. Okay, enough sappiness. I know why you're here, you know why I'm here. We're here for the style study. So today's video was very kindly requested by one of my followers, Lynn, on Instagram as mlynx5. And it was chosen out of a poll by my lovely patrons. Today we're going to study the style of very popular digital artist Ilya Kuvshinov. Don't ask me how long it took me to actually learn how to say his last name. If you're familiar with style studies, you can go ahead and skip to part 1, the timestamps are in the description, or you'll find a chapter marker in the seed bar below. But if you're new here, hi, welcome! Style studies are where we look at some of our favourite contemporary artists and see what we can learn from their style. Keyword, learn. Because we're not trying to copy someone's work, only see what we can learn from their style so we can apply it to our own skills. I usually structure my style studies in 3 parts. In part 1, we'll analyse Ilya's work and see what we can learn from his style. Part 2 will be a study of one of Ilya's original paintings. The reference I chose today was this one. And in part 3, we'll apply everything that we learned today to an original painting of our own. So as always, if you enjoyed this video and find it helpful, then please do remember to give me a big thumbs up, hit that subscribe button down below and the notification bell so you don't miss any future uploads on this channel. But now, sit back, relax, and let's dive into another style study featuring Ilya Kuvshinov. Ilya Kuvshinov is a 30-year-old Russian artist and animation director who is currently based in Tokyo, Japan. Although Ilya doesn't share too many personal posts online, on his Instagram a while back he did mention that he moved to Japan for work in 2014. His art has a massive fan base and he has worked with a bunch of industrial giants such as Netflix with the Ghost in the Shell sequel, and he has been a character designer and art director for the Japanese animated movie The Wonderland, or Birthday Wonderland in some parts of the world. Although he does occasionally share some realistic work, today we're going to look at his more stylized character portraits because, well, it's a style study. So the kind of art we're going to learn from today is his more cel-shaded character portraits. To be specific, I would say his art style toes the line between cel-shaded and semi-realistic, since it's not entirely one or the other. But in either case, his amazing work has gathered an audience of over 76,000 subscribers here on YouTube and over 1.9 million followers over on Instagram. And now, the moment you've all been waiting for. Get out your holy scripture and turn on your TV, because it's time to make a televangelist. Look, I know it's a stretch, alright, but this is tradition. Alright, let's do this. So, like we spoke about just now, Ilya's art style lies somewhere between semi-realistic and straight-up cel-shaded character art. And if you've watched my videos for a while, first of all, thank you. But second of all, you know that cel-shaded paintings with visible line art are just not something that come naturally to me. And that's exactly why we're doing this study, because I don't know about you, but if I find that I can't do something very well, my stubbornness kicks in and I have to learn how to do it. And whom better to learn from than the guy who has worked on entire films that feature this kind of art, right? So bear with me today, because this is as much a learning experience for me as it is for you. But I've managed to break Ilya's style down into 5 key characteristics. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list, we're only skimming the surface of his work, so bear that in mind. Alright, let's jump in. So, the very first thing that jumped out at me was that Ilya's color palette is very palatable. The overall color schemes are very traditional and pleasing to look at, and any dramatic value shifts are transitioned smoothly. Here's what I mean. If you look at how he paints skin, you'll notice that there are actually very noticeable value shifts. So you see very light values and you see relatively darker mid-tone values, especially in the outer edges of the face. However, there is usually a smooth gradient between these tones, like you'll often see in the outer corners of the eyes or on the sides of the nose. And this type of transition really helps to make the tones a lot more digestible, if that's the right term. However, what struck me even more about Ilya's color stories is that the brighter, more dimensional areas of his paintings are nicely offset by super dark, super flat tones around it. Although there is a smooth transition between the highlights and midtones, there isn't any in between the midtones and shadows. The darkest tones, generally reserved for the hair and lashes and brows, are hard-edged and don't have too much dimension, which really makes them look super clean. In other words, there isn't too much color noise, and this really adds to the whole pleasing color palette aspect of his work. Another thing I noticed was that his colors are usually very traditional, as in everything is usually the same color as you would see in a real life setting. So the sky is sky colored, the skin is skin colored, and the foliage is foliage colored. Although he doesn't strictly paint bright daylight, his colors and lighting are pretty much always based on how things would look in real world lighting. There aren't usually a million light sources, nor are there crazy complex shadows. Everything looks and feels like it could be happening right outside your window, at least in terms of the color and lighting. In fact, his color and lighting choices really remind me of Studio Ghibli's work, like you see in Laputa or My Neighbor Totoro. Since Ilya paints a lot of character art, obviously we need to talk about the proportions. As with most character artists, Ilya primarily paints very feminine and or female characters whose proportions are very stylized or appear softer and more childlike. So you have the large eyes and the minimized nose and lips, you have the narrow jaw and soft chin. As I'm sure you can guess, this is very manga, particularly when it comes to the relative sizes of all the facial features. However, there are some fundamental differences in Ilya's work that really separate it from traditional manga. The most important difference I found was in the shape of the eyes. You see, although the eyes are definitely the largest feature on the face, they aren't round. While traditional manga eyes are shaped to replicate the soft, round features of a more youthful face, Ilya actually paints the eyes to have very pronounced corners. It's almost a leaf shape in that both the inner and outer corners of the eyes are narrower with sharp edges, while the middle of the eye is still soft and round. And this is why, although the eyes are relatively large, the characters don't look super young. And while the nose is relatively minimized and indicated with generally just the nostrils and maybe a hard line to show the nose bridge, it is actually not completely lost because Ilya uses his soft blending to his advantage here. You see, while there aren't any hard edges, he uses a slightly darker tone to very gently indicate the structure of the nose. So you'll see a slight darkening and redness at just the bulb of the nose or on the bridge of it. You'll also often see a very bright hard edge on the sides of the nostril and the nose bridge, but because the overall tones are already so light, this hard edge is very subtle. The lips are small too, but they are full. That sounds like a paradox, but here's what I mean. Although the size of the lips is small, the shape of them is very rounded and pouty. We'll look at this a little closer in a bit, but this has the effect of making the face look even softer and rounder without hypersexualizing things. In fact, you'll find that Ilya really doesn't push any sexual undertones with his characters. While they aren't overtly modest, his characters have fairly average bodies, and even if they are showing a lot of skin, because the skin is rendered to be so flat and cel shaded, it doesn't allow the characters to appear very sensual. In most of his paintings, Ilya's main focus is the character itself, and so you'll see that a lot of his portraits lie against a flat, solid background. The color of these backgrounds range from soft pastel tones to loud pops of highly saturated color, but you'll find that apart from in the highlights and the rim light, the background doesn't really tint the character too much. So while you'll see a color bloom around the edges, maybe even in the line art, the overall values and tones of the portrait itself aren't super affected by the background. So here, for instance, even though the background is super dark, her skin is still super bright. Here, even though the background is super bright, the skin and hair are relatively darker. And while this may seem very simplistic, I actually think this is a strategic move that goes back to the color scheme. Like we saw a little while back, the color palette in Ilya's work seems very pleasant, almost easy to digest. And this is because the colors are in the exact places and values that you would expect to see them in. And this, I believe, is very characteristic of children's illustrations. You see, art that is meant for a younger audience is very focused on a sense of stability and permanence, because that is kind of what kids really need. So the sky is usually blue, the grass is usually green, and the skin is usually skin toned. And the biggest feature of children's illustrations is that there isn't too much mixing of colors, or as we called it earlier, color noise. So while there might be some bounce light, there is still a clear separation between the different elements in the illustration. Why? Because as a child, that makes it a lot easier to visualize the scene than having to guess where all the elements begin and end in a relatively abstract scene. So in Ilya's work, while everything is rendered to be dimensional, i.e. you have highlights, midtones and shadows, it doesn't feel like realism per se, because there isn't an intense amount of color transfer between the different elements of the painting. Even in complex background scenes such as this one, you'll notice that while every individual element has dimension in itself, there is still a clear separation of colors between said elements. Now obviously I'm only talking about his more stylized environments. In fact, let's take this one and compare it to one of his more realistic environment paintings. Instantly it becomes noticeable the point that we made about color separation. In the more stylized animated type of environment, the colors are very noticeably different. On the other hand, the more realistic environment involves the colors being heavily impacted by each other. So the snow is very blue due to the color of the sky, the trees appear more yellow than green due to the light from the sun, and so on. The tones in the environment play off of each other, and that is what makes the scene appear more realistic, because that is what we see in the world around us. And that's the distinction between his more realistic scenes versus his more stylized work. And that is why I said that his style really toes the line between semi-realism and completely cel-shaded rendering. In fact, let's have a closer look at his rendering choices. Ilya is a complete pro at using his rendering and shading as a compositional element. Now, on pretty much all of the style studies that we've done so far, we've seen that the amount of rendering in each element really helps to drive focus back to the character. Generally, you'll find that the character is rendered with the most detail, while the background is fairly blurry with fewer details, and this is definitely something you'll see in Ilya's work as well. However, he takes this a step further by tinkering with the rhythm of the painting as a whole. We've spoken about rhythm before in the Gouet style study, I believe, where we saw that the more detail you have, the noisier that part of the composition appears. And in order to have a balanced composition, you need equal amounts of visually noisy and visually quiet areas, because remember, it is always about balance. In Ilya's portraits, you'll find that this balance primarily lies in the rendering of the face versus the hair. So in a lot of his work, the face is rendered to be super detailed, while the surrounding hair is painted very flat. So while you'll see a lot of smaller values between the highlights and midtones on the face, the hair is mostly just one dark tone, one midtone, and one light tone, with very little blending between them, if any. However, you will also see the opposite sometimes. So here, you can see that there is a lot of blending and lots of little values in between the darkest and lightest tones of the hair. However, to contrast this, the skin is painted to be super flat, with very little dimensionality in the face. Why? Because balance. When you put a visually noisy element next to a visually quiet one, they contrast each other perfectly, causing the overall composition to balance out really well. You'll also see this in his stylized environments, where if the midground is noisy and detailed, the foreground and background are flat. And if the background is super detailed, the midground and foreground are relatively flat. Again, when I say flat, it doesn't mean that everything is one color. It means that there aren't many in-between values between the light and dark tones. Another thing about the rendering, at least when it comes to portraits, is that there aren't hard shadows on the face. This is a very common trend in character-focused art, since you want the attention driven towards the face. Shadows tend to drive attention away from themselves and towards the brighter elements, so it makes a lot of sense that the focus of the painting is painted to be the brightest or the least shadowy. In fact, I've found that Ilya pretty much only uses the lighting and rendering to drive focus to the face. I didn't really find many paintings with other compositional elements such as leading lines or framing, apart from the hair maybe, but even that framing, I would argue, comes from the values and rendering rather than from the actual framing elements. The final point about his rendering that I want to touch on is the specular highlights. As you well know by now, specular highlights are the brightest opaque pops of hard-edged specks that cause a surface to look super shiny or glossy. So, as always, you'll find these in the wet parts of the face like the eyes and glossy lips. However, in the more stylized paintings, Ilya refrains from putting many specular highlights in the skin itself, mostly because so much of it is already super bright. One place he does place the specular highlights, however, is in the hair. You'll generally see almost this band of little light specks going across the character's hair at about the same place as a crown would go. And also, can I just point out that so many of his characters have a fringe? I mean, I don't blame him at all. Fringes are super cute and he paints them really nicely. But as someone with a very narrow forehead, it is really offensive to me and my homegirl to see all of these fringes that I really can't carry off. No, I'm obviously kidding, but Ilya does love a good fringe. In terms of rendering clothes, he tends to give most fabric the same rendering treatment as the skin or hair, in that there are fairly flat values. The only clothing he renders in a slightly more realistic way is leather. I found that wherever the character is wearing a lot of leather, this is painted to have a lot more dimension, probably because it's kind of impossible to paint leather in a flatter style and still have it look like leather. But in either case, Ilya's main focus when it comes to rendering is to use the level of detail as an element of rhythm and composition. Okay, we're almost there, guys, I promise. When it comes to the finishing touches, there are three main aspects that I want to mention: the line art, the blurring, and the simulated chromatic aberration.
What?
Now, you guys all know just how much I love line art and just how amazing I am at it. I started off painting realism and to this day paint realistic/semi-realistic art, so clean line art just hasn't been part of my workflow ever, as in it just never features in my finished paintings. This is partly why this study has been so much of a challenge, but that's why we love the series, right? Since Ilya works with a more manga style, a lot of his finished paintings contain clean lines. However, they aren't uniform with black lines all the way across the painting. These are colored lines that actually form part of the composition. Here's what I mean. Instead of just separating colors, the lines become the colors. So in the face, for instance, you'll see that the lines are a slightly darker skin tone or a slightly more saturated version of the makeup. The only place really where you'll see a black line is in the eyelashes and eyeliner. All the other lines are generally colored to be a slightly darker tone of the colors that are already around them. And while the lines are fluid and bold, they aren't necessarily perfectly clean. So if we look closely, we do see some sketchier marks, particularly in the corners of the eyes or on the edges of the hair. And I think this really adds a lot of character because it makes you realize that this was painted by an actual person, not a robot that is programmed to perfection. I love finding the hand of the artist in paintings, don't know why, it just makes me so happy. The other thing about the line art that I've noticed is that he will duplicate the line art layer and blur the lower one out, keeping the upper line art layer superimposed in place. What this does is create a bit of gradient around the edges of the line, making it so that the line art blends into the painting below. However, he does still keep the original hard lines as well. So while you can still see all the lines, they don't appear completely out of place thanks to the blurry gradients below them. Smart. And finally, let's talk about the simulated chromatic aberration. I know, trust me, I'll explain it. Chromatic aberration is when you see glitchy colors around the edges of an object. It is generally created by warping the red, green, or blue channels and overlaying that on the original image. It is a super cool effect. I've used it in the past and it really adds a lot of interest to a painting. However, with Ilya's work, I found that while it may seem like there is chromatic aberration, it is actually all hand painted. This is actually something I noticed while painting the study, but what he does is grab a bright red and essentially draw a second set of line art by the edges of the face. It does give you that slight glitchy effect, but it's a lot more organic and you can really customize it to fit the image. Plus, I think he specifically goes with red around the face in order to try and simulate subsurface scattering, which is the redness that you see that comes from under the skin when it's in bright light. It's a cool little effect and I wanted to mention it here because it's so easy to add to your painting. And there we go. Whew, that was a long one. So to quickly summarize part 1, here are 5 key characteristics to the work of Ilya Kuvshinov. Number 1, the color palette is very pleasant and realistic, and there is a good separation between the different tones that cause the painting to appear clean and easy to consume. 2, the proportions are mostly reminiscent of manga, with larger eyes, a minimized nose, small but full lips, and a narrow jaw with a soft chin. Number 3, the background is generally a flat, solid color. When he paints stylized landscapes, however, Ilya makes sure to avoid color noise, creating a very idealistic, clean scene where the colors don't have a very noticeable effect on each other. Number 4, he uses shading and details as a compositional element, balancing out detail-heavy, noisy areas with quieter, more flattened areas just adjacent. And number 5, he finishes off his paintings by coloring in the line art, duplicating and blurring it out, and then superimposing the blurred layer with the original line art, and finally adding a bit of hand-painted chromatic aberration. The reference I've chosen for today is this one. It is called Dew and it was shared on ArtStation about 3 years ago. I thought the reference really captures the portrait aspects that we've discussed in part 1, so it felt like the perfect one to study. Now, obviously, I'm not a pro at line art, but this process has definitely taught me to trust my lines a little more and to also look at them as a compositional element rather than just guidelines. So while you'll see me struggle with erasing and bringing back the lines constantly, I wanted to share with you the whole process unfiltered, just to show you that no matter how long you've been painting for and how good you get at it, there is always opportunities to learn more and get even better.
Let's go.
Towards the end, you'll see me start to add in that manual chromatic aberration with a bright red and orange just around the edges of the hair and face, and even at the ear. Plus, there is a subtle hint of a soft dark blue on the outer edges of the hair, so I'm also throwing that in with an airbrush. So here's the final study for this video, and for how challenging it was, I'm actually really proud of how it turned out. Now, because this style is super different to my usual work, I didn't really want to use this video to paint the next part of my dark astrology series, because then they just wouldn't fit together. So instead, here is a personal piece inspired by some things that I've been going through mentally over the last couple of weeks. Because the study was relatively flat and cel shaded, for this part of the video I used Ilya's slightly more semi-realistic art as references. That said, however, there is a lot more airbrushing that went into this painting as compared to how I usually paint in my own style. I also decided that it just made more sense to get rid of the sketch and pretty much create line art after I had rendered most of the painting already. Look, I know this is not the traditional way to paint more manga-esque art. I know that ideally you want to have clean lines, then create a layer of flats underneath and then paint over the flats. But my brain just doesn't like working like that, so we're gonna do it backwards, okay? Okay. However, I did make sure to include a super flat background, and since we're rendering the skin to be fairly dimensional, I've also made sure to paint the hair and clothes to be flat as well, because like we saw, this helps to drive focus back to her face and skin. As always, this painting is available over on Patreon, along with the final super long tutorial for the month. So make sure you check that out in the description before we dive into a new project for February. But yeah, here's the finished painting. Hope you love it as much as I do. And there we have it. Ilya Kuvshinov, Demystified. As always, I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it helpful. Thank you so much again to Lynn and my wonderful patrons for choosing this style study. I know I learned a lot, especially with the line art, but if you've learned something from this as well, then please let me know by giving me a thumbs up and leaving a comment below. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell so you don't miss another episode in the future. Check out my Patreon if you'd like some more extended tutorials. And as always, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Check out some more style studies up here. They're all really good and really helpful. And I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye!